Hi everybody and welcome to our pre-recorded Apprenticeship Service webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the main changes to the apprenticeship funding rules for 2024 to 2025, and this recording is for training providers and employers. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team and I'll be hosting today's session. If you've joined us through the link to our GoToWebinar page, you can access a handout for this session in the handout section on the control panel. This handout has all of the key hyperlinks that we were referring to during the main input. And at the end of the session, as you leave the recording, you'll be directed to a short survey. We'd really like to know what you thought about our pre-recorded webinar, so please, if you can, take a moment to answer a few quick questions and provide us with your feedback. If you've joined us through our @DFE Sector Comms YouTube channel, the hyperlinks are available in the video summary that you can find underneath where you click play. And there won't be a survey for you guys. Whichever means you've used to join us, welcome to the session, and I hope you pass on the joining instructions to any of your colleagues who might benefit from listening to the session as well. So today I'm joined by Laura Orritt-Hopkins and Kate McDonough, and they're from our Apprenticeship Funding Policy team. They're going to be delivering the main input for us, and they'll be taking us through all of the significant changes to the funding rules for the 24-25 year. So big welcome to both of you as well. Laura, I think you're up first, so if I can, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Nick said, my name is Laura Orritt-Hopkins, and I'm one of the senior managers on the Apprenticeship Funding Policy team at DFE. I lead on the overall production and publication of the apprenticeship funding rules. So we're going to be using this session to talk through some of the key changes to the 24-25 rules, and I'll be joined by my colleague Kate McDonough to talk through the changes. Before I go into the detail of the changes, I wanted to start by giving a bit of an overview of our approach to the work on the rules for 24-25. As you'll be aware, last year we were focused on simplification, and this included an emphasis on format and presentation, where we looked to streamline the rules, removing unnecessary content and duplication. We also amalgamated the 3 rules documents into one, as well as making a number of policy changes designed to simplify the system. For 24-25, we have continued the focus on simplification, with the primary aim of making it easier for employers and providers to support high-quality apprenticeships. We have therefore reviewed the rules and made a number of improvements for 24-25. This time, the focus has been more on policy changes rather than format and presentation. So you'll see that the format and structure of the rules is broadly the same as for 23-24. We've also added a clarification into the introduction to reflect that the funding rules set out the minimum requirements that organisations must meet to receive funding from us. Other sector bodies, for example Ofsted, may have further or additional requirements or examples of best practice. It's important to mention that we've worked with a range of stakeholders who've helped us to make the initial changes and further developments or clarifications. These include AOC, AELP and UVAC, as well as a number of individual providers and employers. So on the 29th of March, we published a draft version of the rules on gov.uk. We then had a 4-week period where stakeholders were able to provide us with feedback. Thank you to everyone who submitted feedback to us. Following a review of all of this, we published version 1 on the 15th of May. As always, changes we've made are highlighted in the accompanying summary of changes document that's also available on gov.uk. In terms of the format for this year, we'll follow what we did last year. So instead of going through the summary of changes in detail, we're going to focus on the key issues and changes to provide more context around the rationale for the changes and any further changes that we've made as a result of your feedback. This does mean, though, that this webinar will not cover every single change, and therefore we'd strongly recommend that you refer to the summary of changes and full funding rules documents if you haven't already done so. If I could have the next slide, please. So this slide highlights the main changes that we've made for 24-25. I'll cover all of these in more detail in a moment, but again, we're focusing on trying to simplify things for both providers and employers, reducing administrative burdens, bureaucracy, and also trying to increase flexibility where it's appropriate. So we've looked at requirements for onboarding and claiming learning support. We've also reviewed the minimum requirement for active learning and made some changes for particular delivery models. We've introduced a new de minimis in relation to subcontracting, as well as widening the flexibilities in English and maths requirements for those apprentices who have learning difficulties or disabilities. We've also updated our transfer policy. It's important to note that these changes have been made directly as a result of stakeholder feedback, and some of the changes have been made following feedback received during publication of the draft rules. If I could have the next slide, please. So the first change I'll cover is around reducing the administrative requirements associated with onboarding an apprentice. Onboarding is something that comes up frequently when we speak to stakeholders about apprenticeships and what's difficult about them and what we need to simplify. It's also important to consider that onboarding is a wider umbrella term and is broader than being just about the funding rules, because there are other processes and systems that providers have to undertake to onboard an apprentice that are outside of the rules. So, for example, things to do with the Apprenticeship Service or processes that providers might have to complete within their own systems. However, we have still looked at what we require providers to do in terms of onboarding from a rules perspective. And we've said this time that the outcome of the initial assessment can now be embedded into the signed training plan, which reduces the number of documents that employers have to review and sign. We've also made some changes to the progress review section, and we've said that whilst the progress review discussion has to be recorded and shared with all parties, that's the provider, the apprentice and the employer, we don't actually require the employer signature on a progress review. So providers can still choose to collect them if they want to, but they're not mandatory. This means that the employers only need to sign off the training plan at the start of the apprenticeship and any subsequent changes to it. So hopefully these changes will reduce the number of signatures and toing and froing that has to occur between the provider and employer. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Kate. If we could have the next slide, please.
Thanks, Laura. So we've also looked at the administrative requirements around learning support. We'd previously said that where learning support is being claimed, that there had to be a learning support review every month. We've now reduced that to every 3 calendar months, as this feels more proportionate and should help to reduce the admin burden on providers. However, this is a minimum requirement, so providers can make a judgment call as to whether reviews should remain more frequent, so monthly or bi-monthly. This review can be part of the progress review discussions. However, this is only in cases where the apprentice has given their consent to share information of their learning difficulty or disability with their employer. And we do expect the first review to take place within the first month of reasonable adjustments being implemented. This is to ensure that adjustments are working as they should be and that the apprentice agrees that these are sufficient in order for them to continue on programme. We've now clarified that an assessment for learning support can take place at any time during the apprenticeship, as we understand that sometimes learning difficulties don't always come to light at the initial assessment stage. And we've also clarified the information about one-off claims for items costing more than £150 and how these can be recorded. So, for example, If the assessment had evidenced that the learner needs a specialised laptop throughout their apprenticeship learning, then the full cost of this can be claimed straight away. Providers would claim for 1 month's learning support, so the £150, and then the additional amount should be claimed through the earnings adjustment statement. However, no further monthly learning support claims must be made for this piece of equipment. This ensures that the provider is reimbursed the full cost, so they wouldn't be affected should the apprentice withdraw from the programme early. The laptop is the property of the provider, so this then can potentially be used to support another apprentice in the future. Next slide, please. So on to care leavers bursary. Now, we haven't made any changes to this section for 24-25. However, as we have been receiving a number of queries recently, we wanted to take this opportunity to remind you about this policy. Eligible apprentices who are in or have left care and started their apprenticeship on or after the 1st of August 2023 are entitled to a £3,000 bursary, and that's assuming that they have not received a bursary payment before this date. Now, this is separate to the £1,000 additional payments that providers and employers can get to support care leaver apprentices aged 19 to 24. We have seen an increase in the number of care leavers starting apprenticeships this year since we introduced the bursary, but we know there is still low awareness of the bursary among some care leavers, employers and providers. So providers must ensure all apprentices under the age of 25 are aware of the bursary and have the opportunity to declare if they are eligible. Now, this should be done before or when the apprenticeship starts, so that the payments can support the apprentice as soon as possible. However, if for any reason eligibility is not recorded at the start of an apprenticeship, we will allow late claims, as long as they are made before the end of the apprenticeship. And in these instances, providers must contact the Apprenticeship Service desk. Providers must record eligibility in the ILR using the Learning Delivery Funding and Monitoring Type EEF and Code 4. This will trigger the bursary payments and, where applicable, the additional payments for the provider and employer. Now, for apprentices aged 19 to 24, providers must also ask whether they consent to their employer knowing they were previously in care. If the apprentice does not want their employer to be informed, providers must record the Learning and Delivery Monitoring Code 362. This will prevent the additional payment being generated for the employer, but it will not affect the bursary or the provider payment. The bursary is payable in 3 instalments of £1,000 over the first year of the apprenticeship, where the apprentice is still in learning at 60, 120 and 300 days. Providers must pass each instalment on to the apprentice within 30 days of receipt. The first instalment will show on the provider's remittance and in the apprenticeship payment reports. The second and third instalments will show on the provider's remittance, but will not show in the monthly payment reports. Further information, including eligibility criteria and evidence requirements, are set out in the Apprenticeship Funding Rules, the Apprenticeships Technical Funding Guide, which is currently being updated, and bursary guidance, which can all be found on gov.uk. I'm now going to hand back to Laura. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Kate. So the next change I'm going to cover is the minimum requirement for active learning. So just to confirm here that active learning is defined as either off-the-job training or English and maths. So in the draft rules, we said that active learning had to take place every calendar month, as in 23-24. But following publication of the draft, we reviewed further feedback around active learning and how this policy can be a barrier to apprenticeships. We've therefore made a change to the active learning policy for certain models of delivery. So where there is a delivery model that's been agreed up front with the employer, and that's been recorded in the training plan, and that delivery model is either a front-loaded or a block release model, we've changed the requirement for active learning so that it only has to take place every 3 calendar months rather than every month. This will apply to new starts from the 1st of August and also any existing apprentices that are on programme on the 31st of July this year. But if you're not doing front-loaded or block release, then you do still have to do some active learning at least every calendar month. If we could have the next slide, please. So I've just popped the definitions of front-loaded and block release on the next couple of slides. We've put these definitions into the glossary in the funding rules because obviously the first question we're going to be asked is, well, what's a front-loaded model? How do you define that? So this slide outlines the definition of the front-loaded delivery model. And if we could have the next slide, please. This sets out the definition for block release delivery model. I won't go into these definitions in detail as they are covered on the slides. But it's really important to emphasise that delivery models must be compliant with these definitions for active learning to be undertaken every 3 calendar months. If your delivery model isn't compliant with those definitions, then the apprentice needs to be undertaking some active learning at least every calendar month. If we could have the next slide, please. One of the other changes that we've made is in relation to subcontracting. So prior to these changes, all subcontractors had to be on the Apprenticeship Provider and Assessment Register, known as the APAR. But we've had feedback from providers and employers to say that they would like to be able to bring in particular specialists to deliver training. But quite often, the amount of training that these specialists might deliver is so small that it's not worth them trying to apply for to get onto the APAR. So we did some work with policy colleagues, and a de minimis limit of £30,000 was introduced in the draft rules, where if you were delivering up to that, then you didn't need to join APAR in order to be able to deliver training. But following the publication of the draft, we had some feedback that this limit was too low. And so we've increased that limit to £100,000 in version 1. We have said, though, that only main providers and employer providers who've got written confirmation from us that they fully achieved the subcontracting standard at the point of subcontracting can use this flexibility. If we can have the next slide, please. So just quickly around flexibility for English and maths for people who have learning difficulties and disabilities. Currently, we have flexibilities around English and maths for apprentices that have got an education, health and care plan or one of those legacy documents. Recently, we ran a pilot that looked at extending those flexibilities to apprentices who do have learning difficulties and disabilities, but don't actually have one of those education, health and care plans or one of the legacy documents. So following that pilot, we've removed the requirement for apprentices with learning difficulties or disabilities to have one of those documents, whether it be an education, health and care plan or one of the legacy documents, and they can now have access to those flexibilities if they need them. Following the publication of the draft, we had feedback on a very specific rule that said that the assessment of the apprentice's ability had to be conducted within 8 weeks of them starting the apprenticeship. Providers told us that they felt that this was quite a short amount of time and that quite often a learning difficulty might not become apparent until later on in the programme. So in version 1, you'll see that we've removed this 8-week rule. And finally, we've said that those flexibilities can apply to both existing apprentices and new starts. Next slide, please. So some of the further updates we've made include clarifying the eligibility rules on apprentices having to spend at least 50% of their working hours in England over the duration of their apprenticeship. So we've received several queries about different working arrangements that have become common since the pandemic. So for example, remote working, permanently working from home and hybrid working, where someone may need to spend some of their time working from home and some of their time in an office. But we've clarified that regardless of their working arrangements, all apprentices must spend at least 50% of their working hours in England to be eligible for funding. I'll now hand back to Kate. If we can have the next slide, please.
Thanks, Laura. So we've made some changes to provide further flexibility on transfers of levy funds. This means that where a training provider, who is also a levy payer, transfers funds to another employer, they are now able to deliver the apprenticeship training for that employer, whereas previously the funding rules prevented this. In this scenario, the provider, who is also the sending employer, can factor in a profit cost. However, it's important to note that ultimately it's the receiving employer's choice as to which provider they use. Sending employers cannot impose any conditions on their transfer funds outside of any pledge criteria. And moving on to co-investment. So following the changes that were made from the 1st of April 2024 to remove co-investment for 16 to 21-year-old apprentices with non-levy paying employers, we've now extended that to include 22 to 24-year-old apprentices who are with non-levy paying employers and who have either an education, health and care plan or are a care leaver. This change has been backdated to new starts from the 1st of April, and we have recently published version 4 of the 2023-24 Apprenticeship Funding Rules to reflect this. Now, should providers have any learners that fall into this second category, so the 22 to 24-year-old cohort, then they will need to contact our help desk in order for the correct funding to be made. And it's important to note that providers will need to obtain consent from the apprentice that they can share their care leaver status with their employer. If an apprentice doesn't provide this consent, then the employer co-investment will still apply. I'm now going to hand back to Laura to close. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Kate. So on to the final slide from myself and Kate. Just to say really that the apprenticeship funding rules for 24-25 version 1 will apply to new starts from the 1st of August this year unless it states otherwise. If you have any queries, you can contact the Apprenticeship Service support line in under the usual arrangements. And important to say and emphasise, as I did at the start, that the funding rules and accompanying summary of changes are available now on gov.uk. As I said before, it's important to read these, as whilst we've covered the main changes, not every single change has been mentioned during this webinar. So that's it from myself and Kate, but I'll now hand back to Nick, who's going to take us through the final slides. Thanks, Nick.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much, Kate. That was a really great update on some of those changes to the funding rules. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to take the opportunity just to tell you about our YouTube channel. I mentioned it earlier on. It's at DFE Sector Comms, and as you can see on the screen, we've got 3 playlists on that channel. And this recording will feature on the webinar recordings playlist, and we'll put that up there by the end of June 24. We also have all of our support videos covering the different functions of the Apprenticeship Service, and they're on the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist. And then we've got some videos created to support the delivery of apprenticeships that are available on the Apprenticeship Support Videos playlist as well. So please do go and visit that and subscribe to that channel and click on the bell icon to get alerts when new content's uploaded. And then, okay, so on to this slide, we've got a few links for some places for you to go to access further support. As I mentioned earlier, we've put a PDF document that you can now access from the control panel on your screen under the handouts tab, so you can get details of the links. So in terms of where to go to get additional support, you can go to apprenticeships.gov.uk. For the few of you that haven't visited that site yet, please do go there. It's got great information for employers and providers about apprenticeships and also the Apprenticeship Service. To register for any of our future webinars, I've got the link on there that you should follow. To access the funding rules document and the summary of changes document that Laura and Kate referred to, there's a link to gov.uk, so you can access those. And for our training provider colleagues, there's a link to the Further Education and Training Providers Community Forum, which, as you probably know, is a peer-led discussion forum for providers. If you've got any specific queries about the Apprenticeship Service itself, you can use the self-service support tool, or you can email them as well, and the contact details are on the slide and the handout. And then finally, if you want details of the bursary payments that sub-apprentices may be entitled to if they're under 25, there's a link to the Apprenticeships Care Leavers Bursary Guidance as well. So that's it. So that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kate and Laura, for your inputs and insight. And remember, as you leave, if you could please complete the short survey, that would be really helpful. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.